Retry. Welcome, everybody. That works fantastic. It's great to see you all here, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this last Thursday evening seminar of this term. I would like to introduce to you Professor Darrick Jolliffe, who will be presenting work that he's doing together with colleagues, Dr. Roxy Short and Mr. Kieran Mendes, on a unique initiative in East London that aims to intervene in the lives of criminals who are released into the community and to improve their outcome. I would just like to say a few things about Darrick and his work. Darrick is a PhD student of this institute. He started as an MPhil student in the same year as when I arrived here in 2000, and he completed his PhD in 2005. He was supervised by David Farrington, and I'm not going to outline a lot of his work. He's done a massive amount of academic work. One of the things that he's very well known globally is his empathy scale, an instrument that has been translated into 25 different languages and is globally used as the standard to measure different aspects of empathy. He's also doing a lot of clinical work with and in prisons and doing research on that, but I want to highlight a number of things of work that is directly also related to the Institute. One of it is that he's currently leading a wave of data collection of the Cambridge developmental study that was initiated by David Farrington. So these are participants that were first recruited into the study at age 6, and they're now age 70. It's the longest study worldwide that traces people's lives in criminology. It now has also data on the children of the study participants, and it has data on the children's children of the study participants, and it's just extraordinary that it is still possible to follow their lives and understand something about the health outcomes of these participants, amongst others about the health outcomes. He's also working together with me at the moment on digitizing the entire extraordinary archive that David Farrington has created in connection with the Cambridge study. So we're digitizing this entire archive in an attempt to make this a resource for future generations of criminologists. And it's a fantastic to have Hannah Gaffney here, who is helping us with that particular project. He's also an honorary research fellow of the Institute as a recognition and a sign that he's working with a number of colleagues at the Institute on a number of relevant projects. Oh, and the last thing that I want to mention, that we're both co-editors-in-chief of the Journal of Developmental and Life Course Criminology, so we share an interest in developmental processes related to crime and delinquency, and so we enjoy working together on that project as well. This is just a short introduction. I would like to give the floor to Darrick, please.
Thank you, Emil. And thanks everybody who's here, and thanks everyone who's watching online as well. I am very much a child of the Institute. The door is right out there.
Can I just,
of course,
briefly interrupt? There is just by way of managing the discussion. Now, there was a plan, and that's those of you who've been here before know that there is a plan that you can ask questions using Slido. Now, in view of the fact that this is a relatively limited number of audience, we will change the rules for today, and you can ask questions afterwards in person. Those of you who are joining us online, could you please either try to, I don't know whether you can make, people who join online can make themselves heard. Otherwise, what I suggest that those of you who join us online, if you have a question, you would like to ask a question, please send me an email via, or something else that they can do. They can do Slido. They can still do Slido. Okay. If you want to ask a question, please use Slido. So those of you who are joining us online, just type in Slido, type this code. You can also scan the QR code. So this is the next technology step that I haven't made yet. So you can also scan the QR code, and then you can write your question. It's only 160 words. One of the things I would like those who want to ask questions via Slido encouraged to do is to put your name. So far, we always had anonymous questions. You can put your name if you like to, and what this allows me to do is to then contact the person afterwards and say, well, what did you actually mean when you asked that question? And so people can elaborate a little bit more on their question. So back to you.
Thank you. Has the screen been shared? There? Got it. Okay. Technical issues behind us. As Manuel said, I am very much a child of this Institute of Criminology. I used to walk into the classes through the red door that's out there. Speaking to Kieran, who I'll introduce in a moment, asking him about his day tomorrow, and he's off to work in a high point prison. The first time I went to high point prison was in 1998 when Alison took me there as part of the MPhil group of the time. I did do my PhD with David Farrington Manuel as my internal examiner. And since that time, I've done a number of things. Currently, I work at the University of Greenwich. One of the places I worked before that was London Metropolitan University teaching forensic psychology. And one of my first students, Roxy Short, who has gone on to now be one of the research managers at the London Pathways Project that we'll introduce, but also a lecturer at UCL. Kieran Manners I first met in 2015, and I didn't want to work with him. We were forced together. We both bid for the same money to the National Federal Management Service, and instead of giving the money to one of us, they forced us together. And we met, and we've been working together ever since on a number of projects, and I'll describe some of those as we move forward. Kieran is a prison-based social worker who spent a number of years working in prison, and I can say that I've learned as much from working with Kieran and Roxy, or similar to the times that I was in class here. What I'll be doing in the brief period of time is really, I view myself as a middleman. I'll present sort of the background, but the substance of the paper really does come from both Roxy and Kieran and the combination of what they provide. So I'll talk briefly about some of the previous evaluations of what the pathway is. I'll talk about some of the research that Kieran and I have done looking at previous experiences that Black people have described about their experiences of prison. We've then done, Roxy has done a fantastic quantitative evaluation using the administrative data that's available for the pathway to look at the relationship between ethnicity and how people might progress in the pathway. And when we found what we expected to find, what we did is we took the results of those studies, Kieran took the results of those studies into prison, presented those to people, and had them had discussions about why these things might be taking place and what might be done to sort of ameliorate some of those issues. So what is the pathway? Well, it's a way of addressing the needs of people who have severe personality disorder. And it's running across England and Wales. It is what's followed on from what used to be called the Dangerous and Severe Personality Disorder Program. This ran for some time in the early 2000s. And what they tended to do was identify people who had committed very serious offenses, and they had units in Whitemoor, they had units in Brampton, they had units in Franklin, and they would assess the risk of these people and they provide those individuals with support. Those individuals, however, were rarely going to be released from prison. And so they decided that it might be better to start to consider widening the criteria. And they looked and changed that as part of the offender personality disorder strategy in 2011. And so it's joint between the NHS and the National Offender Management Service, what's now called HMPPS. And it's about joint working between probation and psychology. So psychology have inputs, how probation is running, with all of the money coming from what used to be spent on dangerous and severe personality disorder programs, with an idea of broadening out, identifying people early on in their sentence so that they can be provided with support as they move through their sentence after they've committed offenses. So who is on the path? Well, it's men there's two separate pathways. There's pathways for men and pathways for women. For men, it's those who are assessed as having a high likelihood of committing a violent or repeating a violent or sexual offense. They're considered high risk of serious harm. That very high risk is based on a probation officer's perception of these things. Women, it's a current offense of violence against the person, criminal damage, sexual offense, or offenses against children. And again, presenting as a high risk of committing an offense. Basically, the idea is trying to identify people who are at a high risk of reoffending, and if they were to reoffend, the offense was going to be of high harm. Then we have this interesting additional element of having a severe personality disorder as part of that. Those of you that know the particular diagnostics of personality disorder know there's no such thing in the clinical nomenclature as a severe personality disorder. But they've created sort of markers of being able to identify that. And another point that that the clinicians look for is that link between personality disorder and the risk, such that treating the personality disorder and providing support to those people with personality disorder will reduce the risk later on. So early identification, this is done automatically. So as soon as someone commits an offense and the offender assessment system is filled in, and we should say we have someone in the room who knows intimately much more about the offender assessment system than me, so we're ready for questions about this. If someone has committed an offense and gotten a life sentence, before 2012, if they got imprisonment for public protection, or if they have a determinate sentence for violence or sexual offenses, they're likely to be screened into the pathway. This would take place automatically as you fill in the forms. Alternatively, if someone has two or more of things you see below, about childhood abuse or difficulties, behavior problems, history of mental health problems, history of self-harm or attempted suicide or attacks on staff, or having 7 of the following 11 criteria. So those 11 criteria as well, aggressive, impulsive, and so forth. So if, as the probation officer is filling in OASIS, it ticks these boxes, the person is screened into the pathway. Completely automated. So that's called screening, which is part of the case identification process. What might take place after that is a case consultation. So the probation officer, probation manager may meet with a psychology specialist to discuss that person's case. It would be a paper-based exercise. This person's committed these sorts of offenses. This is what we know about their history. These are the factors we believe to be associated with it. And what they might very well do then is come up with a case formulation or pathway plan. What is this person going to do from the moment they've entered the system now through their sentence plan, such that we can provide them with support so that when they leave, they are in a better situation. So they may go to a psychologically informed environment to prepare themselves, to get prepared for an appropriate PD intervention service. They may then have an offending behavior program that are often provided either in prison or in the community. And they may go to a psychologically informed environment after that, where they're held in a more therapeutic type of community before they're released as well. And they can be supported afterwards. It's not a linear process. It's not like we go right from screening to PD intervention and so forth. The image that the clinicians tend to share about this is like interlocking natural rocks. So things don't fit together perfectly, but the idea is sort of putting it together in a way that it does fit, even though things are uneven. So this is sort of the way the journey would work, just another description of that. People would enter it, they may have case reviews, There'll be some sort of a formulation, and the support should continue all the way through. That doesn't necessarily mean, again, like I said, it's linear. There can be people that are held in certain environments for periods of time because they're not considered ready for services. Other people may rotate through and come back. But the aims of this pathway, which exists naturally, but where we have the data from is particularly in London, the main one is to reduce repeat high harm and high risk offending. It is also to improve people's psychological health. There is a training component to this as well. We are training probation officers, probation managers to understand what's going on in terms of personality disorder, to have a bit more tolerance. For those of you that do work clinically, you know how challenging it can be to work with someone who has a personality disorder. Things don't operate quite the way that you always want them to. And so getting training for probation managers such that they don't view things as individuals not paying attention or not listening or not wanting to engage, that it's part of the personality disorder. And of course, this is a government initiative. So it is about increased efficiency, decreasing costs, and improving the services generally. This is just a very quick overview of the things that individuals might get as part of the pathway. So it can include things like integrated community pathway services, things specific for personality disorder. It can be things like just dropping in hubs that exist for individuals to be signposted to and attend if they're out in the community. It can be opportunities for paid employment, mentoring and advocacy, providing psychologically informed approved premises. So after people are released from prison, they can go to places that will help continue their journey through services in a psychologically informed way. This piece of research that we've done is obviously not the first on this approach. Some research that I was involved in 2017 was looking at, well, does this have a desired impact on the characteristics and the factors that we hold? So in this particular piece of research, we looked at those people who had been screened on the pathway for at least 6 months, and we compared that to individuals who were similar in a number of characteristics, age, ethnicity, and risk, measured by actuarial risk assessment, who would have been on the pathway, but the pathway didn't exist at the time, so a historical comparative group. And we found that there were some desirable changes. Not surprisingly, there were non-desirable changes for those people who were in prison. So, surprise, surprise, people who were in prison found that their lifestyle didn't improve and they tended to be around criminal associates. That happens when you're in prison, I'm afraid. When we looked at the impact of this, we compared it by looking at 2 risk assessment tools, OGP and OVP, which are dynamic risk assessment tools that predict the likelihood of reoffending later on. It can change. And what we did see is that individuals who were on the pathway slightly improved in those actuarial measures. Remember, many of the people in the pathway were not going to be released such that we could see how they were doing. The other major finding that came out of that piece of research was that people who were on the pathway, although their actuarial assessment of risk generally improved, probation managers' perception of the individual's risk increased. So people on probation viewed those people as more risky, even though their actuarial risk decreased. Perhaps more relevant for this piece of research that's going to follow, we looked at what factors might predict how people move through the pathway. And we found that perhaps, as might make sense, individuals who were considered higher risk, who committed more serious offenses, they tended to move through more quickly. So that's not surprising that probation managers would tend to prioritize those individuals and they would move faster. As a bit of a, say, almost a throwaway analysis at the end, we said, well, what about individuals? Would ethnicity influence whether individuals progressed in the pathway? And what we found was actually individuals who were, we only had the ability to look at individuals who were white versus non-white. Individuals who were not white progressed up to the point of being referred to services, but were much less likely to have actually started those services later on. I'll sort of skip through this. There has been a national evaluation of this, which took a mixed method approach of the pathway. Perhaps, and the only point that I'll draw out from this is when they conducted interviews with people who had experienced the pathway and staff, they reported that one of the most important aspects of the pathway is the trust that was developed between those people who were delivering the services and those individuals who were receiving the services. Unfortunately, for the quantitative evaluation where they tried to look at impact, they didn't really have the data to allow them to determine what was going on. They were only able to compare those individuals who had progressed in the pathway to those individuals who hadn't really. And even then, they didn't find much difference. It wasn't really, they were very limited by the data that exists, and we're trying to improve on that. And I'll then briefly turn to some of the research that's been done on ethnicity in custodial settings. Some of the work that Alison has done is probably the largest study, where they looked at measuring the quality of prison life, some particular items for about 5,000 individuals across 49 institutions. Not surprisingly, those individuals who were Black reported some experiences of direct and indirect racism discrimination, which they noted likely to be because of observations that they observed different treatments based on whether people were Black or people were white. And they noticed a real lack of trust. So people were unlikely to say that they would complain about instances of discrimination or racism because they just didn't trust the system. And this has been repeated in work by David Lammy as well, who looked at racism and discrimination through the entire criminal justice system. Kieran and I did work a number of years ago where we get questionnaires filled in 2 prisons, 374 questionnaires, as well as interviews with staff and prisoners as well. And what we were particularly interested in that time was negative outcomes. So the negative outcomes that can happen in prison is the level of regime that you're on. So you can be enhanced, which is great. You can be standard, which is normal. You can be basic, which is a form of punishment. You can spend time in segregation or parent separation units. You can experience use of force, and you can have a non-progressive move. So you can move from a category D prison, which is open, back to a category C prison, which is a form of punishment. And what we found when we pushed these all together, they were all highly related. Those individuals who tended to be on basic were much more likely to have experienced segregation, use of force, and so forth. When we looked at predicting the independent factors associated with this, we found that if someone had been in prison previously, if they had less than 2 years to serve, and if they were Black, and if they were Muslim, they were much more likely to have said that they'd experienced these negative outcomes. When we spoke to people about this in interviews, they said things like, it's not like the prison is institutionally racist. It's just many of the staff lack this cultural understanding. And much like Alison and Leonidas found, a low proportion of Black and ethnic minority staff is an issue that they noted as well. Again, weren't going to lodge any formal complaints, but the other thing that was noted was simple time pressures on the staff meant that staff weren't doing diversity and inclusion training or unconscious bias training. They could only do it on the lunch hours. And there were constant staff shortages, which meant very quick decisions were being made in stressful situations that often exacerbated negative treatment of those people. So I'll now introduce this study. We wanted to examine whether this pathway progression by ethnicity was robust, whether we would find it again. Unfortunately, we don't have fantastic data. We have routinely collected administrative data. And this data that we have is data that's typically reported back to the commissioners of the service. So there are serious limitations to sort of discuss. We undertook the analysis in a much more robust way than we've done previously, and Roxy will talk about that. And then Kieran will talk us through what the men in prison said about that. So I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Darrick, for that introduction. So just to restate, I'm Roxy. I am the research manager for the sort of London arm of the OPD pathway. I work for London Pathways Partnership. So we're sort of a conglomerate of NHS trusts that manage the interventions for the OPD pathway in London. And I'm also part-time lecturer at King's. So I'm very much a quantitative researcher. So I handle this quantitative part of this study. So our primary sort of research question is whether there was a difference in the distribution of ethnicities across progressive stages of the pathway compared to sort of the basic person who's just been screened in and nothing's happened. And as Darrick said, our data are not perfect. We used administrative data extracted from the National DEIS, which is a case management database for all individuals managed by probation services and HMPPS. So this is data that are sort of routinely collected by practitioners and by frontline staff working with these individuals. It includes details of the individuals that have been screened onto the pathway, so their individual characteristics, their social demographics, their offence details, and their sentencing details. And it also includes details of sort of individual contacts with their offender management team. And these contacts include interactions not only with the individual, but also interactions with their case files. So, for example, if a pathway plan has been completed or a formulation has been done, there will be a contact created on the database. Okay. So for the primary outcome, so I looked at the data in a sort of cross-sectional way. So I took the current active caseload and sort of categorized the individuals into which sort of stage of the pathway they are on, based on the data from the OPD contacts on DES. Let me just skip through these. So I grouped them into sort of 6 stages. So there's the category that they've been screened in, but they've had no other work, so no contacts created on the database. And then we had those individuals that had sort of a case consultation. So as Darrick said before, this could be discussion of their case files with practitioners and psychologists. And another category was whether the individual had a formulation. And again, this is very much a file-based exercise. And these 2 sort of categories, case consultation and case formulation, they are supposed to happen automatically for everyone who's been screened onto the pathway. But they may not occur sort of in this linear fashion. You may have a formulation without consultation. But we thought it was important to include these 2 stages. And then once a case formulation or consultation has been done, then the individual is referred to services. So that could be a number of different things. And then the sort of next category, more progressive, was whether the individuals were actually accessing services. So did it look like from their records on DES, did it look like they were currently accessing interventions? And then finally, did they successfully complete their intervention? So it's, as you can see, the numbers, they do drop off quite significantly as we move through the pathway. So this could just be a problem with the data and the way that the contacts are completed. Maybe if somebody completes their intervention, the practitioner is less likely to sort of go back into the case files and mark something as complete. So things like that, so that there might be sort of more missing data as you move through the pathway. But the great majority of the individuals on the caseload had received either a case consultation or formulation, which is quite promising. So looking at sort of exposures, what could we associate with these pathway stages? So in terms of the primary exposure, we were interested in ethnicity. And based on the numbers that we had, we were able to categorize ethnicity into white, black, mixed, and Asian. So there is potential in the sort of data to offer more fine-grained categories, but it's just that the numbers do just get quite low. So we thought we'd stick with a more robust analysis and use quite wider categories. But obviously there are problems associated with this. And then we thought about what confounding factors might confound the relationship between ethnicity and pathway progression. Well, obviously, and as Darrick mentioned, risk is a big one because you would expect people with higher risk to progress through more quickly because they present the greatest need. So we used offender group reconviction scale score, which is essentially a sort of a percentage risk reoffending within 1 year, and it's based on age, gender, and criminal history. So it's basically a number of static criminogenic factors, and it's quite a nice sort of composite measure of these things. And we also looked at time on pathway. Although for these data, it was sort of the time from when they were screened on to when they had their last contact. So not from the time that they were referred to now. And I also adjusted for sort of the location of the sort of offender manager team, because as we know, London is quite diverse, but the diversity is different in different areas of London, so it's just an important factor to control for. And we also collected other descriptive data, such as age and stage of status. Okay, so just to describe the data that we saw, so you can see here, so you can see here I've done like a stack bar chart of each pathway stage and the percentage makeup of each pathway stage. And you can see here clearly sort of the proportion of white offenders does increase as you progress through the stages. And it seems to be that it's the sort of the black individuals that tend to be underrepresented at the completion and accessing services phases. And this is obviously unadjusted data, but we can see there is a sort of a trend for, you're more likely to have got through to the end of the pathway if you're white. And then looking at other characteristics of the sample, you can see here that the blue bar is the white individuals, so they tended to be a bit older, and the black and mixed and Asian groups tended to be a little bit younger, which is I think what we would expect to see. And we also saw that so looking at the OGRS score, we saw that Asian individuals tended to the mixed ethnicity individuals had higher risk scores and more likely to be in custody, and Asian individuals tended to have been on the pathway for longer, or their data had been there for longer. Okay, so this is quite a heavy graph, but I am going to zoom in on individual aspects. But just to sort of explain what this plot is showing. So this is the sort of a forest plot, and each of the blue blobs represents a relative risk ratio. The whiskers, sort of the 95% confidence intervals, and it shows the risk ratio of black, mixed, or Asian versus white individuals represented at each pathway stage, and that's compared to sort of the screened-in pathway stage, like our baseline stage, and a risk ratio of 1. So if the whiskers cross that vertical line, there's an equal likelihood of that ethnicity to be represented at that stage of the pathway compared to white individuals. And if it's less than 1, it means it's less likely. Okay, and more than 1, more likely. And all of these ratios are adjusted for Ogre's score, time on pathway, and Borough of London. So if we zoom in on the first 2 stages, so these are the case consultation and formulation stages, which should happen fairly automatically. So an individual is screened in, and then there should be some sort of discussion around their case files. And we can see here that black individuals in both cases are less likely to have had case formulation or case consultation. And these do not include the clients. It's simply a file-based precise. Okay. And then if we move down to referral to services, again, Black individuals are less likely to be referred to services compared to white individuals. So again, this may or may not include the client, but it's most likely to have been done based on sort of the case consultation and formulations. It's likely to be more of a file-based exercise again. And then here's where you see the real differences is in the accessing services and completion stages. So this is where there should be obviously at some level of engagement with the individual. And you can see here clearly that Black and Asian individuals are less likely to access services than white individuals. And Black, mixed and Asian individuals are less likely to have completed services. So you can see that the effect seems to get larger as we progress through the pathway. So there are a number of caveats. So we see it appears that Black individuals are underrepresented compared to white individuals at each successive pathway stage, compared to the screened-in population, and to a lesser extent, this may be true for mixed and Asian individuals, but the numbers are very small, so you saw there was quite big confidence intervals there. So the caveats are: this is not research data. So this is administrative data. It relies on the practitioners updating statuses on administrative systems that aren't particularly user-friendly. The systems themselves are not designed with service evaluation in mind. So there's lots of sort of free-form text fields, and we gave the data to somebody else, they might categorize them completely differently. So there's this element, it's not a perfect system, and there's a lot of patchy and missing data. However, this doesn't mean that the data are biased towards any particular ethnicity or particular characteristic of the individual. So to the extent that it's not perfect data, it's going to be not perfect for everyone. It's not just going to be missing for a particular section of the offenders. So whilst it's not ideal, but I don't think that there's some sort of systematic bias associated with the data. And another thing is that we don't know if the individual is in the right place or that's where they're meant to be on their pathway journey. And there's no sort of little box to tick on the system that says, actually, you know, this person's been at the case consultation phase for 2 years, but that's where they're supposed to be. We don't know about the individual. We don't know whether that's where they're stuck there for a reason. And I think that's something that we do need to sort of going forward to try and evaluate these services. It's trying to find some way of capturing that. Okay. So I'm going to hand you over to Kieran.
So good evening, everyone. So as Darrick has alluded to, I've known him for a number of years. He was quite interested in me sharing some of the research and data that has already been discussed with a group of prisoners and staff. He didn't give me very long, about a week. So he was hoping that I was going to be it, but we did achieve something. So my background is I'm a prison-based social worker for the last 12, 13 years, working across diversity, inclusion, and safer custody. I'm really interested in bringing together research, policy, and practice because of the role that I have. You don't find in England and Wales many prison-based social workers. So essentially, I take on a consultancy role. I'm the lead consultant for D&I and diversity inclusion across all Hertfordshire, Essex, and Suffolk prisons for HMPPS. And I work predominantly with Black men serving long sentences. I work with all groups, but some of the targeted work, because of the worst outcomes, is with Black men serving long sentences, including those with gang involvement and serving sentences for violent crime, violent offences. So it's about validating some of the research and findings. In my work, it's really important to give
access to what some of the data looks like in prison to prisoners, because they experience worse outcomes, but they don't know more broadly what it looks like from a national, sometimes even an international perspective. So speaking to some of the men that I did about what they agreed and disagreed with, but more importantly, why, because I felt that this gave a level of authenticity to what we're talking about this evening. So using my access to prisoners to help explore some of those narratives, to interpret the research through discussions. Now, setting up discussions in create a safe environment for prisoners to discuss and speak openly about lived experiences and observations that they've made is very important, because that's about reducing the power inequality that sometimes can happen with interviews. Darrick and I have gone into a number of different prisons over the years. Very interesting in terms of what happens when we rock up, and it's like, well, kind of get on with it. So Darrick and I have spent time through segregation, in the segregation unit, looking through cell flaps at age, you want to come out and be involved in. So it's very interesting about providing prisoners opportunities, because actually there's a lot of enthusiasm when you empower prisoners to have a voice in this space. So just talking informally in some non-structured one-to-one discussions and presenting an opportunity to look at what future outcomes could be improved with the LPP. Again, feedback was just an experience, lived experiences and observations from the participant group made. Who was involved? So I thought actually it was important with discussing this. One of the prisons that I do access is a therapeutic community within the prison establishment. So speaking with a custodial manager, who has actually had experience of working with the offender management unit, aware of the pathway, and spent 18 years in working in prisons. That was interesting in terms of the conversations that we were able to have, some of the feedback, because she made it quite clear that prison staff didn't actually get enough support and training with working with some of the individuals that they do, who do have complex and quite serious PD issues. Prisoner one, Black British, 35 years of age, serving a mandatory life sentence, assessed with having PD issues, and was aware of the pathway plan from the time that he spent in a high security estate. So he had now moved down into a category C prison, but had spent the majority of his time in custody in a high security estate, where actually it was in that there's a lot more support and opportunities to look more specifically at therapeutic based intervention work. He was awaiting an opportunity to enter the TC, 4+ days left to serve. Prisoner two, again, getting a bit of contrast was important. So this individual, non-violent offence while I was in prison, no identified PD issues, had no idea what the pathway plan was about. And I just wanted to kind of get a more broader perspective, because whilst he didn't have PD issues, he was still a prisoner that statistically would experience worse outcomes in custody, and he was able to share some of those experiences part of the discussions. Prisoner three, from mixed heritage background, serving a mandatory life sentence, has again assessed with serious PD issues, subject to, quite interestingly, to psychiatric intervention from a very young age. So he had involvement with psychologists, social workers and so forth since he was around 11, had completed TC early in his sentence, but interestingly, again, wasn't aware of the pathway plan. See, so, you know, somebody with SSPD issues, violent crime, so forth, but wasn't aware and was awaiting the outcome of a recent parole hearing. So the likelihood is he could be released at some time soon. The signs were quite positive for him, but he had no idea what the pathway plan was about. So discussion one was about fairly evidence that casework may be dealt with differently for Black men accessing the pathway plan. Some of the reasons given for that in regards to the formulation, consultation and referral. So as you can imagine, providing prisoners with an opportunity to have open discussions in a safe space to do so, there's a lot that they want to talk about. So I had to summarize some of that, because if not, you know, I could have stood here for a number of hours talking and breaking down some of the critical responses and thinking that was kind of put in place, particularly when you're dealing with individuals who have spent time on the TC. They're very self-aware and aware of the environment they're in, but some of the negative experiences in prison was in relation to staff relationships, something that we see quite regularly. Darrick and I have seen in our own work, and it's well publicised about the challenges that men, particularly from Black backgrounds, have with building, positive working relationships with staff, regular security issues, knockbacks and progressive moves, suggesting that Black and mixed heritage offenders were seen as being higher risk than white offenders without being provided with the evidence. Now, being provided with the evidence is very important because Black prisoners are aware of what the data tells them. They're aware from lived experiences, they're aware of the criminal justice system, from arrest to court experiences to prison experiences and community re-entry. But it's not very often that they are given some kind of backdrop about why that is. They're just subject to it and they're involved. So that was important. Some of the perceptions and opportunities I gave were more willingly offered to white prisoners than Black at all stages of the criminal justice. Again, risk, security bias and so forth. A quote that I took was that this issue isn't just about the pathway, it's the same everywhere in prison for Black prisoners. And from working with prisoners from the high security estate, young offenders, the juvenile state, and those who are awaiting community re-entry, this narrative is one that comes up time and time again. And unfortunately, it's maybe suggests that we haven't really progressed this far enough over the last decade or two. A lot of the research is bringing up the same types of issues, but we need to be more solution focused. Hence why my working in a multidisciplinary capacity as a social worker, working alongside the psychology team and so forth. That's one of the focal points. Section by one prisoner involved in the discussion is that racial stereotyping by professionals did not impact all Black offenders, which is really interesting. But if the reference point, however, was a Black offender with serious PD, high risk of repeat offending, it would, quote, be inevitable that at some point discrimination would be involved, that no one would have answers for. And this is in relation to the decision-making process. It was reflected in what Roxy talked about in some of the slides before. Concerns also raised about how qualified or experienced staff were involved in the LPP. Now, because a lot of offenders, those in prison and those in the community, won't have a lot of knowledge about the LPP process, when it is revealed to them, it can create barriers to who's involved and what kind of experience that they have with working with that particular group of individuals. One of the quotes that I took was about forensic psychologists. Now, again, myself, I work quite closely with the psychology team, but the quote was, how can the trainee forensic psychologists make decisions about the right type of support for a Black offender with serious PD issues, from a traumatic gang lifestyle and a violent community? They have no idea how all this impacts a person's life. Talk to an individual who's 45 years of age and he's spent the last 20 years in prison. And actually, the interactions that he's having is maybe with a trainee forensic psychologist who's been in the job 2 years. His take on that and his perception of that is that, he's aware that he struggles in a number of different circumstances and situations, and he's looking for answers. But yet he looks across the table and he is likely to come to the conclusion that it's not going to happen in that type of support. Okay. Discussion point 2, there is evidence that Black offenders are less likely to access the LPP service. So this is after the referral has been made, and this is partly down to a decision that they may have in whether they want to access services or not after the opportunity to be presented. Perception was shared that engaging with psychology can be problematic and progression can be impacted. Now, working with a number of prisoners that I have over the years, this is again a commonplace in the narratives that's shared. I often get requests by prisoners if I can actually attend psychology assessments with them. Psychology department are usually happy for that. And there's nothing that I actually add or contribute to the conversation, but actually what it's about, it's the individual feeling that they may not be able to interpret exactly what is going on in the process, and myself being consistent in that space, being able to unpick that outside of assessments and go through what some of that outcome looks like. A quote that was given by one of the prisoners: if you're Black and with a long sentence, you're concerned about any intervention involved with psychology. Now, with the LPP having a psychological backdrop, again, this can be quite traumatic. It was talked about. Concerns were raised again about stereotyping, perceived racialized assessment processes. And while we don't know that categorically, we're just dealing with what the data is saying. There are clearly differences in terms of the way that assessments are being undertaken, black offenders and white offenders, and those being referred to the LPP. Due to the reluctance to engage in psychology, it suggested that the LPP will only be something that black offenders were willing to engage in if it was essential to lowering their risk. So what we're suggesting here, I guess, is that even if it's presented, if there is a way for an individual to navigate around having to access the LPP or anything that involves psychology, they will. However, if it's deemed necessary to lower risk, it will be, therefore maybe be something that will be a little more interesting for them to be involved in. But again, we didn't have a big enough cohort to get more to dig in to drill down a little bit deeper. But again, these are not things that I haven't heard before. Discussed that as a lot of confusion amongst black prisoners. Interesting about the body of work. Now, what we're dealing with 2023, I guess, is that there's a great deal of awareness around research. Prisoners have a lot more access to research in prisons. They have computer access. There are a number of programs that are run by this institute, by this university in particular. A few of these prisons that I've worked in, and there's been students from the university accessing the prison. So there is opportunities for prisoners to talk more about the experience of offenders in the criminal justice system and how it impacts and who it impacts. But yet, when talking about the issue of black offenders, quite interestingly, there were discussions about it not being framed by the narratives of black men in prison in the UK. And how actually it was quite interesting that one prisoner shared with me that a lot of the research that he'd come across in studying for his own criminology, his own degree in criminology, psychology, was that a lot of the research available was based around, framed around the Black American experience or the black experience in the US. So again, you know, prisoners have a great deal of insight and awareness of these issues. The question was asked, what body of work is informing professionals working with us? As a black prisoner, being on the LPP means you will be different to others. It was discussed that there's a fear about being othered related to past experiences, which would impact the likelihood of engaging with the LPP. This was about being marginalised with peers, but also internal conflicts. Again, by understanding and having the acknowledgement that the body of work informing the LPP might not actually be reflective of their experiences, but yet knowing that if they need to lower risk in order to continue with their progression, this may be something that they have to be involved with. School settings, past interactions with social work, the mental health came up as being at the core of where somebody's past negative experiences may have come from. Another experience around mental health is that, again, and this really reflected the intergenerational issues of black people accessing mental health services, okay? So this quote was that, although mental health is less of a taboo subject for younger prisoners in general, black prisoners will be aware of the experience of older generations of black people supported by mental health services, by relatives, aunts, uncles, parents, grandparents, and there's still issues with the way black people get support by mental health services. It would be nearly impossible to engage these offenders on the pathway. So again, having to look at maybe improvements that have been made with mental health services and the understanding of groups who feel marginalised, who won't access services with mental health and support. What we're talking about is some of that intergenerational learning, which is also reflected in relationships that are understood within black communities and police, black communities and the experiences and understanding of the prison system, the criminal justice system as a whole. These things are sometimes passed down. So an individual may not have actually had a negative experience himself accessing mental health services, but you put that out there and it's like, actually, I know how people are dealt with, who look like me, who come from my background. I don't want anything to do with it. Very interesting, because it's a role that sometimes I found myself playing in sitting an individual down and actually talking through what that actually looks like for them as an individual. It's not my job to convince anybody to access support, but at the same time, maybe it's not framed in a way which is culturally relevant to them. And somebody's actually asking them the questions about actually what role does your ethnicity and your cultural background play in your view. Discussion point 3 is that black offenders, screen. Less likely to complete the LPP. So again, this is those who have started but are less likely to complete. For those with previous negative experience mental health services, again, have been sectioned, less likely because it's quite traumatic. Again, we spoke about that. Some black offenders who meet the criteria will probably benefit from the pathway, but won't trust it. Instead, they will internalise their struggle. This is really quite powerful. This is talking about an individual with serious PD issues who had been sectioned earlier in this sentence and has had involvement with mental health services and so forth. But instead, because of the lack of trust, it's that sometimes we will instead internalise our struggles with mental health. Eventually, we mentally break, and the whole process becomes much more problematic. Now, we see this in data across coping mechanisms in prison, accessing support, and it's not just explicit to black communities. For example, working with the Gypsy Rum and Traveller community in prison equally, there are a lot of barriers culturally to accessing support services in prison around mental health. But what that tends to look like is higher risk around self-harming and attempting in committing suicide. Black prisoners don't have that as an outcome, but actually at the cause of the problem is this lack of trust in services, which tend to look at the cultural differences. Quote, anytime you're asked why you're being treated differently to white offenders, you never get a straight answer. I think professionals working at different levels of the LPP would rather work with white offenders because they don't know how to work effectively with black offenders. We then make a decision at the end for us. Now, again, this is taken from some of the experiences of those more broadly, and not just for this discussion point, but spend a long time working in and around therapeutic communities. I have spoken to a number of individuals who have left the TC at some point, and this was really reflective of how they felt, in the fact that they just didn't feel it was for them. They didn't feel that they could be, it was safe to speak openly about experiences that they had which may be culturally different or didn't fit into the box, which meant that treatment would be a linear process as they may see their white peers with their white peers. It's also suggested that refusing support was associated to negating a sense of being vulnerable. Again, something that we see the same with other community groups from minority ethnic backgrounds. Discussion point 4, find discussion points of what can be done. A designated pathway manager, similar to LIFO managers. Now, I'm not certain if LIFO managers are still present in all establishments, but this was something that was more common maybe 10 years ago. But the role of the LIFO manager was one based in the community, based in custody. But the suggestion was that this is something that could also impact and be beneficial if also based in the community that are not ONU and not psychology and only deal with LPP issues as a single point of contact. It was suggested that for young black offenders especially, they would benefit from this type of direct support due to their lack of confidence in the wider prison system. So by having an individual to work with who wasn't associated with psychology or the offender management unit, but was very aware of the processes involved, and could also be somebody that an individual could speak to about any concerns that they had. They suggested that this might be quite impactful. The LPP needs to run alongside the offender sentence plan and managed accordingly, so that the same transparency regarding goals and planning. Now, this here was really about the self-management and the role that offenders would like to have in dictating their own rehabilitation, and also that assistance trajectory. What goals do they want to set? How can they be involved in leading on their own rehabilitation? And how can they be a stakeholder? They don't want to feel at times that an intervention or service is being done onto them, but they want to feel that it's a relationship can be built so it's mutual in identifying what issues and concerns are that need to be addressed. More transparency again about the LPP, especially developing more trust in the LPP process with black offenders. Lack of disclosure. So again, this goes back to the fact that majority, this is correct, isn't it, Roxy? The majority of offenders on the LPP are not aware that they've been assessed for the process. So again, what we're saying here is this potentially creates a barrier when it is presented at a later opportunity. But actually, if this was something that's presented a lot earlier and run alongside the sentence plan, particularly when you're dealing with an individual who's serving a considerable sentence for a violent crime, it essentially, for those who I spoke to, would make more sense if it was done that way. In regards to community settings, so moving a little bit away from the custodial setting, it was discussed that the environments need to be more accommodating to Black offenders. It was important towards the likelihood of them completing the LPP. And this is about Black offenders feeling marginalised in some psychologically informed environments, particularly those who have attempted TC or PIPE in the past. They may withdraw because they feel that the environment is not a safe space to discuss culturally relevant issues. Empathy, big one. A great level of empathy for Black offenders through training and development. Now, this goes back to the discussion I had with the member of staff who'd worked 18 years in the job in a therapeutic prison, ONU experience pathway, whatever. And the fact that there seems to be a real lack of training and development if we're expecting professionals to work with a cohort, Black men experiencing worse outcomes, who considerably, time and time again, there are worse outcomes, but yet staff are not actually equipped with the skills or the knowledge to actually work specifically with that group, which I found quite interesting. It didn't say including psychologists, but this is more broadly about those working in and around interventions like the LPP. So finally, some considerations that were made by prisoners. Specific involvement of offenders that have completed the TC to further study the issues around the LPP. So as I've experienced in other areas of my practice, those who have completed the TC in the past usually have the ability to respond more critically to issues. And that was reflected in the discussions that I had. And they said that, you know, it'd be quite important to use them who have first-hand experience of being involved in therapy to help forward the discussions around the LPP. A thematic review of the experience of Black offenders on the LPP was also a suggestion. Whilst not explicitly expressed during the discussion, what the primary concern about the LPP alluded to was the theorising of experiences of Black offenders in the UK, as I've already discussed. Offenders involved in discussions all suggested that cultural incompetence, again, an issue throughout the criminal justice system, was a significant issue. And what you have to remember is these individuals, they see previous reports that are written on them. They've read the LAMI, they have read the recent HMIP thematic race review that's just been released in December last year. They read this stuff. So they know that this stuff is happening. They read the experiences of not just Black offenders, but also Black staff working in those environments. So what that's showing us is that what they're saying is we need to be more involved in the discussions, maybe, at improving some of the concerns that we have. Offenders also discuss the LPP, like most community re-entry interventions, would more accurately prescribe to the social context and framing of the white experience, as we've spoken to. But more importantly, it was suggested that white offender, a Black offender, similar offender history in that position on the LPP, it may be likely if the risk for the white offender was still higher, would still experience better outcomes on the LPP. Now, well, we could say that, well, maybe this is a perception. But again, whilst we know that Black offenders, Black young offenders in particular, and this goes back to my work working in the juvenile state, and whilst this might be a little outdated, but at the time, you know, being a young Black offender, committing the same crime as a white offender, young offender, same age, similar crime, going before being sentenced, you're 9 times more likely to go to prison committing the same crime as a white offender as it was as a Black offender, and as a young offender, that is. Now, again, when you're dealing with these guys in the adult state, they give first-hand experiences of that. So when they're saying, regardless, we are going to experience worse outcomes, they're talking from lived experience, okay? And what they're saying is, we see time and time again, our peers, our white peers, friends, co-defendants, you know, with better outcomes in regards to the interventions that they, and progression that they seem to make throughout the justice system. Other feelings applying further research: what extent the barriers play for Black offenders disclosing experiences as victims of violence and abuse? And again, this goes back to the therapeutic intervention work, and does the LPP need to include more culturally relevant trauma-informed interventions? And finally, what extent did cultural norms and differences play for Black offenders?
So I'll close this out then. Thank you very much, Karen. As you can see, the pathway is really challenging. It's not linear, and there are many issues. And ideally, and remember, I am a child of the Institute. And what do? At the end of all of our research studies? We call for research. And if you had the PhD supervisor I had, you asked for prospective longitudinal studies. So what you want to do is, instead of looking at different stages, what we want to do is start with 2,000 people at the beginning of the pathway and follow them all the way through. Like they did with the surveying prisoner crime reduction study that Ian Brunson Smith and Catherine Hopkins had. The other thing that we want to do, if we wanted to look at the impact of particular interventions on the pathway, is use randomized controlled trials, right? The best way of equating people in all measured and unmeasured characteristics. Fantastic. But what we've just learned, of course, is if we're to do that, and I'm sure you're aware, we're going to conduct that research, we need informed consent, and we need people to put themselves forward, which means we can do that, but we're not going to, those approaches are not going to be successful for us identifying the experiences of Black people on the pathway, because they will self-select out. Astoundingly little has changed since Alison's work in 2006, gender and therapy before that, our work in 2016, 2017. The exact same things are being said. It's like we're speaking to exactly the same people. The same narratives exist. The key things that we know for personality disorder treatment are things like therapeutic alliance, trust, and engagement. Research that Roxy's produced, a systematic review, shows that those are really important mediators for successful treatment of people with personality disorder. And those characteristics are exactly the things that are missing from in their experiences. We have gendered approaches to the pathway. We have a female pathway, and that's non-controversial. But culturally aware and responsive approaches just don't exist. So we have a long way to go. We have some people that we'd like to acknowledge who have made today possible in all of their supply of the data, helping us, in some cases hiring us. And so we'd like to end with the acknowledgements of these people here, and thank you very much.